8 husbands, 8 deaths, 1 woman. In the world of true crime, few names inspire as much intrigue and as much terror as Ruth Holloway. To some, she was a victim of tragic coincidence, a woman cursed by fate to bury every man she ever loved. But to others, she was far more sinister, a mastermind who used love as a weapon and marriage as a death sentence. They called her the Killer Widow, a nickname that would follow her for decades, long after the final grave was filled. And the question that haunts us to this day is chillingly simple. Was Ruth Holloway a woman born under a cursed star, or was she carefully and quietly planning the demise of every man who dared to marry her? The story begins in a time when appearances meant everything, a time when small communities were bound together by Sunday church services, backyard gossip, and the watchful eyes of neighbors. Ruth Holloway grew up in this world. To many, she was the perfect image of femininity, soft-spoken, elegant, a woman who always seemed to know exactly what to say to put others at ease. But hidden beneath that polished exterior was something darker, something that wouldn't be fully uncovered until the bodies began to pile up. Over the course of her lifetime, Ruth would walk behind 8 coffins, 8 men who had once sworn to protect and love her until death do them part. And death came swiftly, sometimes as illness, sometimes as a sudden accident, sometimes in ways too strange to be explained. Each loss earned her sympathy, at first. But with every funeral came whispers, whispers that grew louder, whispers that transformed into accusations. They say history has a way of burying the truth along with the dead. But Ruth Holloway's story refused to stay buried. Too many coincidences, too much money changing hands, too many grieving families asking questions, and too many lives cut short. For investigators, one question always loomed large: motive. Why would a woman kill the very men she vowed to cherish? For Ruth, money was always within reach. Each husband left her with financial security, land, or a life insurance payout. But for those who knew her, it wasn't just about wealth. Some claimed she had a hunger for control, that she thrived on the power of being the one left standing when everyone else was gone. In the end, Ruth Holloway became more than just a woman. She became a symbol of how thin the line can be between love and death, between loyalty and betrayal, between a wedding vow and a death sentence. Ask 10 people about Ruth Holloway, and you'll hear 10 different stories. To some, she was a fragile woman cursed by destiny, a victim of bad luck so cruel it bordered on the supernatural. To others, she was a calculating predator who used charm as a weapon, pulling men into her web and disposing of them when they no longer served her purpose. What makes Ruth's story so unforgettable is not just the body count, but the way she seemed to hide in plain sight. She attended church every Sunday. She baked pies for her neighbors. She wrote sympathy cards to widows while becoming one herself again and again, every time she appeared as the grieving wife, until the truth began to creep out from behind the funeral flowers. And so, this story is not just about Ruth Holloway. It is about the fragile trust we place in those closest to us. It is about how love can blind us, how suspicion can be silenced by a smile, and how death can be made to look like an accident. Most of all, it is about the terrifying possibility that evil does not always look like a monster. It can look like the woman next door. 8 husbands, 8 deaths, and 1 widow who walked away from every grave. This is not just a crime story. It is a legend. The legend of Ruth Holloway, the Killer Widow. The story of Ruth Holloway does not begin with murder, or even with suspicion. It begins in the quiet folds of small-town America, where the streets were lined with elm trees and everyone seemed to know everyone else's name. Ruth was born into a family that valued appearances above all else. Her parents were not wealthy, but they were respected. Her father worked long hours at a local mill, while her mother was known for her sharp tongue and her insistence that Ruth grow up to be a lady. From an early age, Ruth learned that charm was currency. She watched her mother greet neighbors with warmth, only to close the door and mutter something cruel under her breath. Ruth saw how words could bend perception, how a smile could soften judgment. By the time she was a teenager, she was already skilled in the art of appearing innocent, of saying exactly what people wanted to hear. Teachers adored her, neighbors praised her manners. And yet, there was something behind her eyes, a stillness, a calculation that made a few people uneasy, though they couldn't quite explain why. Ruth was striking, but not in the obvious way. She wasn't the kind of girl who turned heads at first glance, but she had a quiet magnetism that drew people in. Men, especially, found themselves fascinated by her. She listened intently, laughed at the right moments, and always left them, feeling important. She understood, even before she could fully articulate it, that men wanted to feel like protectors, like providers. Ruth gave them that feeling, and in return, she gained their loyalty. By the time she turned 18, Ruth was ready to step into a new role, wife. Her first marriage came quickly, almost inevitably, as though it were the natural progression of her carefully crafted image. His name was Thomas Green, a local farmhand with strong hands, a broad smile, and dreams bigger than his paycheck. He fell for Ruth the way so many others would, completely, blindly, and without hesitation. The wedding was modest, but beautiful. Neighbors gathered in the church, admiring Ruth in her white dress, the lace veil her mother had sewn by hand. Thomas looked at her as though he had won the world. Ruth looked back with a soft smile that convinced everyone she felt the same. In those early months, the couple appeared happy. Thomas worked the fields, bringing home just enough money to keep the small house they rented. Ruth kept the place spotless, always greeting him with dinner on the table. To outsiders, they looked like a picture of newlywed bliss. But cracks began to show quickly. Thomas, ever ambitious, dreamed of buying land, starting his own farm, building a future from the ground up. Ruth, however, had different ambitions. She liked comfort. She liked security. She liked knowing she wouldn't have to worry about bills or manual labor. To her, love was not just about affection. It was about what she stood to gain. And Thomas, though hard-working, could not provide the life Ruth believed she deserved. Still, she played the role of the supportive wife, smiling at church gatherings, hosting Sunday dinners, whispering sweet words in Thomas's ear when others were listening. But behind closed doors, she was restless. She criticized his lack of progress, his small earnings, his inability to move them up in the world. Thomas, in his good-natured way, brushed it off at first. He believed time and effort would prove him right. The first tragedy struck just 2 years into their marriage. Thomas fell ill suddenly, struck down by what doctors at the time labeled respiratory failure. He had been coughing for weeks, but no one suspected it was serious until it was too late. He grew weaker, his chest rattling with each breath, until one night he collapsed in their home. Ruth's screams echoed down the street, drawing neighbors, who found her cradling his body, tears streaking her face. The community rallied around her. They spoke of how cruel it was for such a young woman to be widowed so soon. They brought her casseroles, flowers, prayers. At the funeral, Ruth wore black and clutched a handkerchief, her sobs breaking the hearts of everyone in the church. People whispered that she was too young to know such grief. They admired her strength, her composure, the way she thanked everyone for their kindness. What no one noticed, or at least what no one dared say aloud, was how quickly Ruth seemed to recover. Within weeks, she was seen smiling again, speaking about the future. Some chalked it up to resilience. the kind of strength her mother had, drilled into her. Others felt a twinge of unease but quickly silenced it, ashamed of doubting a grieving widow. What stood out most was the inheritance. Though Thomas had not been wealthy, he had taken out a small life insurance policy through his employer. To most young couples, it was barely worth considering, just a precaution. But in death, it left Ruth with a comfortable sum, enough to free her from worry for the foreseeable future. She moved out of their rented home, bought herself nicer clothes, and was often seen with a renewed glow about her. Was it the natural resilience of a young woman refusing to let grief consume her? Or was it something colder, an early glimpse into a pattern that would repeat itself 7 more times? At the time, no one could imagine Ruth Holloway as anything more than unlucky. But looking back, the first death was where the story truly began. The whispers started faintly, almost guiltily. Some said Thomas's cough hadn't seemed fatal. Others wondered how Ruth had managed the funeral arrangement so quickly, or why she seemed less devastated than expected. But in a small town, where everyone knew everyone, suspicion was dangerous. Ruth's charm disarmed most critics, and her tears silenced the rest. The whispers died down, replaced once again with sympathy. For Ruth, however, the experience had left an impression. She had seen how easily tragedy could be masked by circumstance, how quickly people could be swayed by appearances. She had walked away from her first marriage with both sympathy and money, and she had done so without a single accusation sticking to her name. It was perhaps the first time she realized just how much power she truly held. The young widow, dressed in black and draped in sorrow, became an object of fascination. Suitors began to circle within months. Some were drawn by pity, others by her quiet allure. And Ruth, now tasting independence and power for the first time, began to understand that marriage was not just a union, it was an opportunity. Her first husband's grave was barely settled into the earth before Ruth's eyes turned forward, searching for the next man who might step into the role Thomas had left vacant. Whether she sought comfort, security, or something far darker, no one could say for certain. But history would remember Thomas Green not just as a man lost too soon, but as the first name in a series of tragedies that would stain Ruth Holloway's story forever. After Thomas's death, Ruth's life changed in ways that only sharpened the attention of those around her. She was still young, still beautiful in her understated way, and suddenly she was independent. She carried herself with a new kind of confidence, one that drew people toward her even more than before. Widows, especially young ones, held a certain mystique in those days. They were seen as tragic figures, touched by misfortune, but also as women with wisdom and depth beyond their years. For Ruth, that aura became a powerful weapon. The first year of her widowhood was filled with appearances at church socials and community gatherings, always dressed in elegant black, always polite, always smiling just enough to remind others she was healing, but never so much that it seemed disrespectful to Thomas's memory. Neighbors whispered about how admirably she carried her grief. Men, especially those a little older and with some money to their names, began circling more openly. They brought her flowers, offered to help with chores, and visited under the pretense of checking in on her well-being. Ruth, always careful, never seemed too eager. She let them come to her one by one, until she set her sights on the man she believed could give her the stability Thomas never could. His name was George Holloway, and he would become her second husband. George was not as young as Thomas had been. He was in his mid-30s, a widower himself, with a small but respectable farm and steady income. Unlike Thomas, George had financial security and the respect of the community. He was a practical man, dependable, known for his honesty and for the way he treated those around him with fairness. When he met Ruth, he was immediately taken by her poise, her quiet intelligence, and the tragic circumstances that seemed to make her even more delicate in his eyes. The courtship was brief but intense. George visited often, helping Ruth with household repairs, escorting her to church, ensuring she had what she needed. Soon their closeness became the subject of gossip, though most of it was approving. People saw in George the perfect match for Ruth, a man who could give her stability and protection after the cruel hand fate had dealt her. Within a year they were married. The town celebrated the union, remarking on how wonderful it was that Ruth had found love again. At first the marriage seemed happy. George was attentive, generous, and deeply protective of his new bride. He provided her with a comfortable home and the security she had long desired. For Ruth, this was a step up, a life more comfortable than the one she had shared with Thomas. She wore finer clothes, entertained guests with confidence, and basked in the admiration of being the wife of a respected man. But behind the polished veneer, subtle fractures began to emerge. George was not a dreamer like Thomas. He was practical, yes, but also cautious, careful with money, reluctant to indulge Ruth's growing appetite for luxury. She wanted more comfort, more status, more of everything. George, though kind, was not a man to be easily swayed. He managed his finances with care, refused unnecessary risks, and kept a tight hand on his earnings. To Ruth, this practicality began to feel like limitation. Friends who visited noticed small tensions. Ruth would smile, but her eyes would harden when George disagreed with her. At dinner parties, her laughter sometimes carried an edge, as though mocking rather than celebrating. Her husband, George, for his part, seemed unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge that beneath his wife's sweet exterior lay a simmering discontent. Then, just 3 years into their marriage, tragedy struck again. George fell ill, much like Thomas had before him. At first, it was brushed off as fatigue from farm work. But his condition worsened rapidly. He grew weak, pale, his body racked with stomach pains that doctors struggled to explain. Ruth was, once again, the attentive wife at his bedside, spooning broth into his mouth, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth, calling for the doctor at all hours. Neighbors spoke of her devotion, of how tirelessly she cared for her husband in his time of need. But as George's condition declined, whispers began to surface. People couldn't ignore the eerie similarity to Thomas's death. 2 husbands, both young, both seemingly healthy, cut down by sudden and inexplicable illnesses. Was Ruth cursed? Was she doomed to lose every man she loved? The word widow began to take on a darker tone when attached to her name. When George finally died, Ruth played her part flawlessly. She wept at the funeral, her cries echoing through the small church as mourners shook their heads in sympathy. Once again, the community rallied around her. And once again, Ruth walked away from the tragedy with more than grief. George had left her, his property, his savings, and the security she had long craved. But this time the unease did not fade as quickly. A few of George's relatives were suspicious. They questioned the speed with which his health had declined, and some even whispered that Ruth's care might not have been as benevolent as it appeared. There were quiet conversations about whether George had been poisoned, though no one dared accuse Ruth directly. Without evidence, the suspicions remained just that, rumors whispered in kitchens and behind closed doors. Still, a pattern was beginning to take shape. 2 husbands dead, both under mysterious circumstances, both leaving Ruth better off than before. It was coincidence, perhaps. It was tragedy, perhaps, but for those who were paying attention, it was also unsettling. Ruth, however, seemed untouched by the rumors. She carried herself with the same grace, the same soft voice and careful smile that had won over so many before. She attended church faithfully, hosted gatherings, and continued to play the role of the grieving yet resilient widow. To those who confronted her with kindness, she spoke of her sorrow, of how she seemed destined to be alone. To those who doubted her, she offered nothing but polite silence, knowing full well that suspicion without proof was powerless. In the months following George's death, Ruth began to transform again. No longer the naive young bride of Thomas, nor the ambitious wife of George, she now stood as a woman who had buried 2 husbands before the age of 30. She wore black, less frequently, instead dressing in muted colors that emphasized her maturity. Men still noticed her. Some pitied her, others admired her strength, and a few, perhaps recklessly, saw in her a chance at love with a woman who seemed both fragile and captivating. For Ruth, the world had revealed its secrets. Twice now, she had stood in the role of grieving widow. Twice, she had walked away wealthier, freer, more powerful than before. And twice, she had escaped suspicion unscathed. Whether by design or by fate, she had discovered that death in her hands could be transformed into opportunity. The whispers would not stop, but neither would Ruth. The second death marked not the end of her misfortune, but the beginning of a pattern, a dark rhythm that would continue to echo through the rest of her life. And as she looked forward, scanning the faces of men who still sought her attention, she must have realized that the path ahead was clear. Love, in Ruth Holloway's world, was fleeting. But power, money, and control, those could be permanent if one was willing to pay the price. George Holloway's grave joined Thomas Green's in the silent rows of the cemetery, another marker in the growing trail behind Ruth. To the community, she remained a woman touched by tragedy. To those who dared think differently, she was something far more dangerous. And though no one could yet prove it, the legend of the killer widow was beginning to take shape. By the time Ruth buried her second husband, she had already begun to take on an almost mythical presence in the small community. 2 husbands gone, in quick succession, was tragedy enough to invite pity, but it was also enough to make people uneasy. Whispers turned into cautious gossip, though never loud enough to reach her ears directly. Some claimed she was cursed, that misfortune followed her like a shadow. Others lowered their voices and muttered darker suspicions, though always with the assurance that such things couldn't possibly be true. Ruth herself wore her grief like a finely tailored garment, slipping it on when she needed the sympathy of others, setting it aside when she was alone. If the losses weighed on her, she didn't show it. In fact, she seemed more poised than ever, moving through the world with a confidence that came from survival, and from the resources left behind by both Thomas and George. She was no longer simply a widow. She was a woman of means, a woman who had twice stood at the edge of despair and walked away stronger. Suitors came, as they always did. Some were drawn by her beauty, others by her mysterious aura, and a few by the undeniable allure of her growing independence. It was during this time that she met her third husband, Edward Miller, a traveling salesman with a sharp wit and an eye for opportunity. Unlike George, Edward was not cautious with money. He lived for the moment, spending freely, enjoying life's pleasures without hesitation. To Ruth, he was a refreshing change. His charm was infectious, his energy boundless, and he promised her a life filled with excitement rather than restraint. Their marriage was quick, almost impulsive, a whirlwind romance that took many by surprise. Ruth seemed radiant, almost reborn, as she walked down the aisle once again. Edward adored her, showering her with gifts and affection, promising her the kind of indulgence she had long desired. For a brief time, Ruth seemed content. But indulgence has its costs, and Edward's lifestyle was not sustainable. He spent more than he earned, borrowed more than he could repay, and soon the cracks began to show. Creditors came knocking, and Edward, once so confident, began to falter. Ruth's discontent grew. She had not married a man to find herself dragged, into debt. She wanted comfort, not chaos, stability, not creditors at the door. The charm that had once thrilled her now seemed reckless, even foolish. And then, as if fate had intervened once more, Edward fell ill. The sickness came suddenly, striking him down with fever, sweats, and violent stomach pains. Doctors were baffled, unable to pinpoint the cause. Neighbors once again spoke of Ruth's devotion as she nursed him tirelessly, but behind their praise was an undercurrent of unease. Edward's decline was swift, and within weeks, he was gone. Ruth, now a widow for the third time, played her part to perfection. She wept at his funeral, spoke of his charm and kindness, and accepted the condolences of a community that had begun to question how one woman could endure so much tragedy. Edward had left her little in the way of savings, but his small insurance policy ensured that Ruth did not walk away empty-handed. It was here that the whispers grew louder. 3 husbands, 3 graves, 3 tragedies too similar to be ignored. Some spoke openly now, suggesting that Ruth's very presence was dangerous, that men who married her were doomed. They called it the widow's curse, a phrase that began to follow her in hushed tones at church gatherings and behind closed doors. Still without proof, Ruth remained untouchable. She smiled. She thanked her neighbors. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman forever touched by misfortune. And when suitors came calling again, as they inevitably did, she did not turn them away. Her 4th husband was Samuel Turner, a quiet man with a gentle spirit. Unlike Edward, Samuel was not flamboyant or reckless. He was steady, dependable, and deeply kind-hearted. He worked as a clerk in a nearby town, bringing home a modest but reliable income. To many, Samuel seemed like the perfect antidote to Ruth's turbulent past. Here was a man who would treat her with tenderness, who would offer her peace instead of drama. Their courtship was longer, more deliberate, perhaps because Samuel was cautious by nature, or perhaps because Ruth knew the gossip surrounding her had reached dangerous levels. By the time they married, Ruth had once again convinced the community of her sincerity. She was still young, still beautiful, and many believed she deserved another chance at happiness. For a time, their marriage appeared calm. Samuel adored Ruth, speaking often of how lucky he was to have found her despite her tragedies. Ruth, in turn, played the role of the devoted wife with practiced ease. She kept their home in order, attended church faithfully, and entertained guests with charm and grace. But beneath the surface, the same restlessness stirred. Samuel's gentle spirit, while comforting at first, began to bore her. His modest earnings, his simple routines, his quiet contentment, they were not enough for a woman who had tasted wealth, attention, and control. And so the story repeated itself. Samuel began to fall ill, struck by a mysterious weakness that left him pale and bedridden. The doctors were baffled once again, unable to explain his rapid decline. Ruth was, as always, the devoted wife, tending to him with unwavering care. Neighbors shook their heads at her endless misfortune, though this time their sympathy was laced with suspicion. How could it be possible, they asked, for one woman to lose 4 husbands in such similar ways? When Samuel died, Ruth's reputation began to shift irreversibly. The phrase widow's curse was no longer whispered by a few. It was spoken openly. People crossed the street when they saw her coming, uneasy in her presence. Men who once courted her now kept their distance, their eyes filled with wary calculation. Mothers warned their sons to stay away, fearful that marrying Ruth Holloway was a death sentence. But Ruth did not falter. She stood at Samuel's funeral with dry eyes, her face a mask of sorrow that some now saw as rehearsed. She accepted the condolences of her community with the same quiet grace as always. And though the whispers grew louder, she remained untouched by accusation. No one dared confront her directly, no one dared bring forth evidence, and so Ruth walked away once again with money, property, and the chilling reputation of a woman whose love was fatal. By now, the legend of Ruth Holloway had taken root. 4. Husbands dead, each leaving her better off than before, each death cloaked in mystery. To some she was cursed, to others she was dangerous. And to Ruth herself, she was untouchable. The world had shown her that tragedy could be manipulated, that appearances could silence doubt, and that death could be a tool wielded in her favor. As she stood at the edge of her fourth husband's grave, the whispers of the community swirling around her like the wind, Ruth's eyes were dry, her back straight, her expression unreadable. She had mastered the role of the grieving widow, and she knew the performance would serve her again. For Ruth Holloway, the curse was not misfortune. It was power, and the trail of graves behind her was only halfway complete. By the time Ruth buried her fourth husband, she was no longer just a woman touched by tragedy. She was a figure both feared and gossiped about, a name that drew uneasy glances whenever it was spoken aloud. 4 men had pledged their lives to her, and 4 men had ended up in graves far earlier than anyone expected. To outsiders, it might have seemed like a grotesque coincidence, but to those who lived near Ruth, who watched the funerals stack one upon the other, the whispers of the widow's curse had transformed into something sharper. Still, Ruth remained untouchable. She carried herself with grace, her voice calm, her smile polite, never giving her neighbors the satisfaction of seeing cracks in her composure. The rumors might have swirled, but no one dared accuse her openly. There was no proof, nothing tangible, to connect her to the deaths of Thomas, George, Edward, or Samuel. Each had died from an illness or unexplained decline. Each had been attended by Ruth herself, the seemingly devoted wife. If she was guilty of something darker, she left no evidence behind. It was in this shadow of suspicion that Ruth met her 5th husband, a man named Henry Whitaker. Unlike her previous husbands, Henry was older, in his late 40s, a widower with grown children. He owned a small general store in town, making him a man of modest wealth and solid reputation. To some, he seemed an unlikely match for Ruth, who still carried with her the allure of youth and beauty. But to Ruth, Henry represented something different, a kind of financial security and respectability that could silence some of the gossip that had begun to cling to her. Their courtship was quiet, deliberate. Henry's children were wary of Ruth, whispering among themselves that their father was being drawn into something he didn't understand. But Henry, perhaps blinded by Ruth's charm, insisted that she was misunderstood, that her tragedies had unfairly painted her as something she wasn't. Ruth played the part well, soft-spoken and kind, often speaking of her desire to build a peaceful life away from the shadow of her losses. Henry believed her. Within a year, they were married, for by a time Ruth seemed to have what she wanted. Henry provided her with comfort and stability, and she reveled in the respectability of being the wife of a well-regarded businessman. Yet, as always, cracks began to form. Henry's children did not trust her, and their suspicion made Ruth bristle. She did not like being watched, judged, or whispered about. She also discovered that Henry, cautious by nature, was not as generous with his wealth as she had hoped. He managed his store carefully, kept accounts in strict order, and resisted Ruth's subtle pushes for more indulgence. Then came the familiar pattern. Henry began to fall ill. At first it was dismissed as exhaustion from long hours at the store, but his condition worsened quickly, sharp stomach pains, weakness, and a decline that baffled the local doctor. Once again, Ruth played the role she knew so well. She sat at Henry's bedside, cooled his forehead with cloths, and whispered words of comfort while his children stood at the doorway, their eyes narrowed in suspicion. When Henry died, the grief of his children was laced with anger. They muttered that something was not right, that their father had been healthy before Ruth entered his life. They even voiced their concerns to the authorities, suggesting that his death deserved closer scrutiny. For the first time, the whispers began to solidify into something more dangerous. But the investigation, such as it was, found nothing conclusive. Henry had died of what was recorded as acute gastritis or possible food poisoning. In a time before modern forensics, such causes were accepted without much question. Without proof, Ruth walked away once again, the beneficiary of Henry's estate, the woman who had survived yet another tragic marriage. By now, Ruth's reputation was nearly unbearable. She could feel the eyes of the community on her wherever she went. The whispers had turned into pointed stares, and though few dared say it outright, many believed that Ruth Holloway was not simply cursed, but cursed in a way of her own making. Still, even suspicion could not fully isolate her. There were always men, curious, reckless, or perhaps drawn by the perverse allure of a woman surrounded by death, who sought her attention. Her sixth husband was Charles Davenport, a man of ambition who worked as a railway foreman. Charles was younger than Henry, closer to Ruth's age and full of vitality. He was drawn to her beauty, her air of mystery, and perhaps to the challenge of being the man who could break the curse. When he courted her, he did so boldly, ignoring the warnings of his friends who cautioned him against becoming entangled with a woman whose husbands never seemed to survive. Ruth welcomed him with open arms. Charles's energy, his ambition, his confidence. These were things she found attractive. To her, Charles represented not only stability, but also the possibility of new opportunities. She saw in him a chance to reinvent herself once more, to silence the gossip by proving that she could sustain a happy, healthy marriage. Their wedding was less well attended than her previous ones. By now, many in the community kept their distance, unwilling to celebrate what they believed would end in yet another funeral. But Ruth did not seem to care. She wore her wedding dress with pride, smiled for the photographs, and walked down the aisle with the composure of a woman who had done this too many times to count. At first, the marriage seemed strong. Charles adored Ruth, often speaking of her resilience and beauty. He dismissed the talk of curses as nonsense, refusing to believe that tragedy was anything more than coincidence. But as months passed, the cracks began to show once again. Ruth grew restless, dissatisfied with his long hours and modest pay. She wanted more money, more status, more indulgence. Charles, though ambitious, was not wealthy, and his work often left him exhausted. And then, like clockwork, he fell ill. The symptoms were familiar: stomach pains, weakness, an illness that baffled doctors and progressed too quickly for anyone to intervene. This time, however, the whispers were not confined to kitchens and backyards. People spoke openly of their suspicion. How could it be that every man Ruth married ended up in the ground? Charles's death marked a turning point. The authorities began to take notice in a way they hadn't before. There was no formal accusation, no evidence that could stand in court. But there were questions, serious questions, that could no longer be ignored. Why did Ruth's husbands always die under similar circumstances? Why did she always emerge financially secure? Why were the deaths so sudden, so consistent in their mysterious illnesses? The investigation was limited, constrained by the medical knowledge of the time and by the lack of physical evidence. But Ruth was questioned more directly than she ever had been before. Neighbors testified to the strange pattern. Henry's children spoke bitterly of their suspicions, and whispers of poison began to circulate in official channels. Ruth, however, remained calm, collected, her answers measured, her demeanor flawless. She insisted she had done nothing but care for her husbands, that she was as much a victim of fate as they were. And without proof, there was little anyone could do. Still, something had shifted. For the first time, Ruth's carefully constructed image of the grieving widow was cracking under the weight of suspicion. She could feel the change in the way people looked at her, in the way investigators lingered on their questions, in the way whispers seemed to follow her into every room. She had survived 6 husbands now, each death leaving her wealthier, more independent, but also more infamous. The title Killer Widow was no longer just gossip. It was becoming a reputation that law enforcement could not ignore, yet Ruth did not retreat. If anything, she seemed emboldened. The investigations had yielded nothing concrete, and she had once again walked away untouched. To her, this was proof of her untouchability, proof that no matter how many husbands she buried, no matter how many whispers followed her, the world would never be able to pin anything on her. Henry Whitaker and Charles Davenport lay in their graves alongside Thomas, George, Edward, and Samuel. 6 men gone, 6 funerals, 6 tragedies that all led back to the same woman. The community no longer believed in curses, they believed in patterns, and though Ruth remained free, her every step was watched, her every word measured against the growing legend of a woman who had outlived them all. By the time Ruth married for the 7th time, the very act of her standing at an altar had become an event steeped in unease. 6 men had already stood beside her, and 6 had been lowered into the ground. Each funeral had been explained away, an illness, an accident, a tragedy of circumstance, but the whispers never stopped. Neighbors spoke of her as if she carried death in her very presence. Mothers pulled their sons aside and warned them not to be foolish, not to fall under her spell. Men, once bold in their pursuit of her beauty, now kept their distance, afraid of what association with Ruth Holloway might mean. And yet, despite all of it, there was always someone willing to take the risk. His name was William Harper, a man in his mid-30s, strong, handsome, with a confidence that bordered on arrogance. William was different from Ruth's earlier husbands in one crucial way. He had heard the stories. He knew the whispers, the suspicions, the rumors that clung to Ruth like a second skin. But instead of frightening him, it seemed to embolden him. He told his friends that he didn't believe in curses or gossip, that people exaggerated tragedy because they wanted a story to tell. He said Ruth was misunderstood, a victim of cruel fate, and that he would be the one to prove everyone wrong. When he courted her, it was with the swagger of a man convinced he could handle what others could not. Ruth, now older but still striking, knew exactly how to play her role. She leaned into the image of the misunderstood widow, speaking softly of her grief, her loneliness, her desire for a man who could finally bring her peace. William listened, nodded, and assured her he was strong enough, smart enough, and brave enough to be that man. Their marriage was smaller than the ones before, fewer guests in attendance, fewer smiles in the crowd. People came not to celebrate but out of morbid curiosity, as though waiting to see whether William would be the next in line to fall. The dull air inside the church was thick with unease, the silence between hymns louder than the music itself. Even as Ruth and William exchanged vows, there was a sense of inevitability, a quiet dread that hung over the ceremony like a storm cloud. At first, the marriage seemed different. William was not easily cowed, and he refused to let the gossip bother him. He stood proudly beside Ruth, dismissing the murmurs, glaring down those who dared to smirk in his direction. For a while, Ruth seemed almost content. William was stronger than her previous husbands, more assertive, more difficult to bend to her quiet manipulations. But with strength came defiance, and soon cracks began to show. William was not a man to hand over control easily. He kept a close watch on his finances, refusing to indulge Ruth's subtle requests for more luxuries. He questioned her temper. When it surfaced, challenged her when she criticized, and made it clear that he was not a man to be dominated. For the first time, Ruth found herself facing resistance, and it unsettled her. Control had always been hers, carefully masked behind the veil of tenderness and sorrow. But with William, the mask slipped too easily. Their arguments, though never public, grew sharper, filled with the tension of two people unwilling to yield. And then, one evening, William confided to a close friend something that revealed just how deeply the whispers had reached him. "If anything happens to me," he said quietly, "don't let them call it bad luck. Don't let them say it was just fate." His friend, startled, pressed him to explain, but William only shook his head. He didn't admit to fear, not openly, but the words lingered, a confession of doubt from a man who had sworn he was above it. The fear crept in slowly. He began to notice small things, an odd taste in his drink, a strange smell in his food, the way Ruth watched him when she thought he wasn't looking. He brushed them off at first, blaming paranoia stirred up by gossip. But as time went on, the unease became harder to ignore. William, the man who had once mocked the idea of curses, now kept a cautious eye on his own wife. And then it happened. The same pattern that had haunted 6 husbands before him. William fell ill. It started with nausea, then severe stomach pains, then a weakness that left him unable to rise from bed. The doctors came, puzzled once again, muttering about possible infections, spoiled food, stress. But William knew. As he lay in bed, sweating, clutching his stomach, he whispered to his friend, "It's happening, just like the others." Ruth, of course, played her part. She was at his side constantly, tending to him, wiping his brow, spooning broth into his mouth. To the outside world, she was the image of devotion. Neighbors, weary of their own suspicions, admitted grudgingly that she seemed sincere, that perhaps they had judged her too harshly. But those closest to William saw the fear in his eyes, the way he recoiled slightly when Ruth leaned too close, the way his hand trembled when he tried to push away the food she offered. His decline was rapid. Within weeks, William Harper was dead, his body lowered into the ground beside the others. Ruth, once again dressed in black, stood at the graveside with dry eyes and a solemn expression. She did not weep, not openly, not like she had in her earlier marriages. She didn't need to. The role of grieving widow was second nature by now, her silence more powerful than any show of tears. But William's death was different. He had spoken his fears aloud. He had told people not to accept the easy explanation of bad luck. And now, in the aftermath of his passing, those words echoed. His friends, his family, even some in the community who had long held their tongues, began to push harder for answers. Why had every man who married Ruth ended up the same way? Why had William, once so strong, so confident, so alive, withered and died so quickly? The authorities were forced to take notice. Investigators reopened questions about her past, examined patterns in the deaths of her husbands, and began to consider more seriously the possibility that these were not coincidences at all. Poison was whispered about more openly now, not just in kitchens, but in police offices, in the chambers of doctors who reviewed the symptoms with furrowed brows. Still, without modern science, there was little that could be proven. The bodies of her earlier husbands had long since decomposed, the evidence gone with them. The doctor's notes were vague, the records incomplete. Suspicion was everywhere, but proof remained elusive. For Ruth, William's death was both a victory and a warning. She had gained, once again, his savings, his possessions, his name added to the list of men who had given her status and security. But she had also seen the shift, the way suspicion now clung to her more openly than ever. The whispers had turned into accusations, even if they weren't yet spoken to her face. The fear William carried in his final days had not died with him. It had spread, infecting those around her, strengthening the legend of the killer widow. And yet Ruth carried on as if untouched. She walked the streets of her town with her head held high, ignoring the way people crossed to the other side rather than pass too close. She attended church, her face serene, her prayers whispered with the same soft conviction as always. She entertained guests in her home, offering tea and pastries with the practiced charm of a hostess who had nothing to hide. But inside, she must have known the tide was turning. She must have felt the eyes that lingered on her too long, heard the words that followed her into every room. She had survived 7 husbands now, each one leaving her richer, more independent, more infamous. And though she still stood free, untouched by the law, the legend of Ruth Holloway had become something she could no longer control. William Harper had believed he was strong enough to resist the curse. He had believed he could be the one to prove everyone wrong. Instead, he became the 7th name carved into stone, another victim of love's most dangerous vow. And as the dirt fell onto his coffin, the fear he had confessed in his final days became a prophecy, a warning that those who loved Ruth Holloway would never escape alive. By the time Ruth married for the 8th time, the air around her was thick with suspicion. Her name was no longer whispered in hushed tones, but spoken aloud with fear and certainty. People had begun to call her the Black Widow in private, a title that followed her like a shadow. 7 husbands had come and gone, each buried too soon, each death explained away by illness, accident, or cruel misfortune. But the pattern was undeniable, and even those who wanted to believe in coincidence could not look at Ruth Holloway without feeling a chill. Her 8th husband was Charles Denton, a man who should have known better. He was a businessman, older than her previous husbands, a man who had made his fortune through calculated risks and sharp decisions. Charles was not naive. He had heard every story, every rumor, every chilling detail of Ruth's history. Friends begged him to reconsider, to stay away, to understand that no amount of charm could erase the graveyard behind her. But Charles was stubborn. He was wealthy, shrewd, and used to bending the world to his will. He believed that Ruth's reputation was just that, a reputation, a story exaggerated by gossip, a myth inflated by fear. He was determined to prove everyone wrong. When Charles proposed, Ruth accepted with her usual quiet smile, the same smile that had disarmed men for decades. The wedding was almost empty this time, not the festive gatherings of her youth, but a muted affair, with only a handful of guests who came out of obligation rather than joy. No one believed this marriage would last, not in life. They whispered during the ceremony, wondering if Charles would be dead before the year was out. Ruth, in her white gown, ignored the stares. She had played this part before, and she knew it well. At first, Charles believed himself immune. He was not blinded by love in the way the others had been. He did not let Ruth dominate him, nor did he indulge every whim. He treated her with respect, but also distance, maintaining a firm control over his money, his business, and his health. He was not reckless with food or drink. He did not allow himself to be lulled into the kind of dependency that had weakened her earlier husbands. He was cautious, methodical, and perhaps a little arrogant in his belief that he could outwit the woman who had outlasted 7 men before him. But even the cautious are vulnerable when the enemy is inside the home. The tension began quietly. Ruth would cook his meals, offer him wine, set the table with a gentle smile. Charles, suspicious of her reputation, often refused, making excuses, claiming he had already eaten or wasn't thirsty. At first, Ruth seemed unfazed, but over time, her patience wore thin. Her charm became brittle, her smile more forced. Charles, for all his bravado, could feel the walls closing in. He began to confide in his associates, telling them he was watched too closely, that Ruth seemed restless when he declined her food, that there was a heaviness in the house he couldn't shake. Then came the illness. It struck one evening after Charles attended a business dinner. He returned home feeling ill, his stomach churning, his head swimming. He assumed it was food poisoning from the event, but the symptoms worsened over the following days. Nausea, vomiting, weakness, an almost identical pattern to the deaths that had preceded him. Charles, despite his pride, knew the truth. "It's her," he muttered to a close confidant, his voice weak, his hands trembling. "It's always been her." Unlike the others, Charles did not suffer in silence. He fought back. Even as he grew weaker, he reached out to his doctor, demanding tests, demanding answers. He instructed his lawyer to document his suspicions, to put in writing that if he died, it should not be considered an accident. For the first time there was a trail, not just whispers, not just suspicions, but words and actions from a man still alive, pointing directly at Ruth. Neighbors noticed the difference too. Ruth was no longer able to hide behind the mask of innocence so easily. Charles's friends visited the house, checking on him daily, their eyes sharp, their questions direct. They watched the way Ruth hovered at his bedside, offering him spoonfuls of broth that he refused, her expression darkening each time. They saw the way he flinched when she touched his shoulder, the way his gaze darted toward her as though she were the enemy. The illusion was unraveling, and for the first time Ruth could feel it slipping beyond her control. Charles lasted longer than most. He was stubborn, determined to survive if only to spite her. But the sickness overwhelmed him. After weeks of struggle, his body gave out, leaving him pale and lifeless in the very bed he had once shared with Ruth. She did what she always did. She screamed, she cried, she summoned neighbors with her show of grief, but this time the performance fell flat. People no longer saw a grieving widow, they saw a predator caught in the act. At the funeral, the crowd was larger than expected, not out of love for Charles, but out of morbid fascination. The whispers were no longer quiet. People spoke openly of the curse, of poison, of Ruth's pattern of death. Some refused to shake her hand. Others stared at her as though she were a monster in their midst. She stood at the graveside, her veil pulled low over her face, but the mask was cracked. For the first time she looked uneasy, as though she could feel the weight of all those eyes, all that suspicion pressing down on her. After Charles's death, investigators moved quickly. His written suspicions, his conversations with friends, his insistence that something was wrong, all of it gave authorities the leverage they needed. They questioned Ruth directly, their tone sharper than before, their patience thinner. They dug into her past, into the records of her previous husbands, into the pattern of sudden illnesses and untimely deaths. What had once been dismissed as coincidence was now impossible to ignore. For Ruth, the 8th marriage was not just another step in her deadly cycle. It was the turning point, the final straw that broke through years of deception. She had outlasted suspicion for decades, slipping through the cracks of weak evidence and the limitations of the time. But Charles Denton was different. He had spoken too loudly, left too much behind. His voice, preserved in testimony and memory, would echo long after his death. Ruth remained defiant in the face of it all. She denied everything, of course. She insisted that her husbands had been unlucky, that fate had dealt her a cruel hand. She claimed to be the victim of gossip, of small-town prejudice, of a society eager to blame a woman for tragedy she could not control. She played the part she had perfected, soft-spoken, sorrowful, misunderstood. But the walls were closing in. Charles Denton was her 8th husband, and he was the last. With his death, the cycle ended, not because Ruth chose it, but because the world around her finally refused to look away. The legend of the killer widow was no longer just rumor. It was fact, etched into the lives of 8 men who had loved her and paid the ultimate price. And as the dirt settled over Charles's coffin, Ruth Holloway stood alone, the weight of her choices heavy in the silence that followed. She had once believed herself untouchable, a master of appearances, a woman who could bend the world with a smile. But the final straw had been pulled, and her carefully woven web was beginning to unravel. The death of Charles Denton did not vanish into quiet burial and fading memory the way Ruth's previous marriages had. Something about this one was different. His suspicions, his warnings to friends, his notes to his lawyer, all of it lingered in the air long after the funeral procession ended. Where the town once pitied Ruth, they now regarded her with thinly veiled hostility. The charm she had relied upon for years began to dissolve, and for the first time, her name carried with it the weight of accusation. The investigation began quietly, almost cautiously. Detectives from the county arrived in town under the pretense of routine inquiry. But their true purpose was clear. They wanted to know why so many men tied to one woman had fallen dead, all under circumstances that echoed the same chilling pattern. They combed through death records, each yellowing certificate telling the story of sudden illness, of unexplained collapse, of frail explanations that had never truly satisfied. Individually, each case could be explained. Together, they told a story too loud to ignore. Neighbors and acquaintances, once reluctant to speak ill of Ruth, began to find their voices. Interviews revealed a litany of small but telling details. The men had always fallen ill shortly after meals prepared by Ruth, their symptoms eerily similar from one husband to the next. Several neighbors recalled her uncanny composure during each decline, her calculated care, her unshaken resolve. One former friend admitted she had stopped eating food offered by Ruth, though she could never explain why, only that something about the woman made her stomach twist with unease. The investigators pressed further, looking into the finances. What they discovered was a trail of modest but consistent benefit. Each husband had left Ruth with something: life insurance, savings accounts, property, or personal possessions of value. Individually, the amounts were not extravagant, but across 8 marriages the pattern was undeniable. Ruth's fortune had grown steadily, fueled not by her own labor but by the graves of the men who had loved her. When they questioned the local physicians, more threads began to weave together. The symptoms described in each case, nausea, stomach cramps, relentless vomiting, eventual organ failure, fit the profile of poisoning, though at the time, the technology to prove it had been limited. The doctors admitted they had been baffled by the similarity of each case, but had chalked it up to coincidence, bad luck, or undiagnosed disease. Looking back, their voices carried a hint of shame, as though they now realized they had been pawns in Ruth's performance. Ruth herself faced questioning with the same composure she had always displayed. Seated across from detectives in her parlor, she clasped her hands in her lap, her black dress pristine, her hair pinned neatly in place. She answered calmly, denying any wrongdoing. Her voice steady even as the questions cut sharper. She insisted she had been cursed with misfortune, that fate had taken her husbands one by one, leaving her to carry the unbearable weight of grief. Her eyes welled with tears at just the right moments, her tone trembling as she described each burial. For years, this act had convinced everyone around her. But the detectives were not neighbors offering condolences. They were trained to see through performance. They noticed the way her eyes hardened when she thought no one was watching, the cold steel beneath the veil of sorrow. They caught the flicker of irritation when she was pressed too hard, the brief moments when her mask slipped. They began to call her the most dangerous actress in the county, a woman who could play her part so well that even death itself seemed scripted. The turning point came when Charles's personal lawyer handed over the documents his client had written in his final days. The papers were stark and damning. Charles had explicitly stated that if he died, suspicion should fall on Ruth. He described her insistence on preparing his food, his growing fear of her presence, his refusal to eat her cooking in the final weeks. He wrote of his belief that she had been involved in the deaths of her previous husbands and that he feared he would be next. The words of a dying man, preserved on paper, carried more weight than any rumor or whisper. They gave investigators the foothold they needed. Armed with this testimony, authorities obtained permission to exhume the bodies of 2 of Ruth's earlier husbands. It was a grim process, disturbing graves that had lain undisturbed for years, but the results were decisive. Traces of arsenic were found in the remains, enough to silence any lingering doubt. The evidence was no longer circumstantial. The deaths were no longer coincidences. Ruth Holloway had not been cursed, she had been the curse. News of the findings spread quickly, igniting the town like dry tinder. For years, people had suspected, whispered, wondered, but now their fears were confirmed. The woman who had walked among them, attended church beside them, smiled sweetly as she exchanged pleasantries, was a murderer, a serial killer, hiding in plain sight. Mothers clutched their children closer. Men spoke of how narrowly they had escaped her gaze. Former friends refused to admit they had once admired her. Ruth, however, did not crumble under the weight of evidence. She continued to deny everything, even as arsenic was named, even as the testimony of Charles Denton echoed in courtrooms and newspapers. She claimed she was the victim of hysteria, that the town had turned against her because she was a woman who dared to survive. She painted herself as a martyr of circumstance, her voice calm, her eyes steady, as though she could still bend reality with performance. But this time, it was not enough. The investigators had more than whispers. They had science, testimony, financial records, and a trail of graves too neat to be ignored. The tide had turned irrevocably, and the woman who had once stood untouchable now found herself cornered. The community, which had once given her sympathy, now recoiled in collective anger. They gathered outside her home during the nights of questioning, lanterns glowing in the dark, their murmurs rising into chants. Some shouted for justice, others spat her name like a curse. It was as though the entire town sought to purge itself of the years it had spent under her spell. For Ruth, the performance was nearly over. The investigation had pierced the veil she had so carefully woven, exposing not just a pattern of tragedy, but a calculated web of murder. She was no longer the grieving widow, the misunderstood beauty, the victim of misfortune. She was Ruth Holloway, the killer widow, and the world was finally ready to call her by her true name. The courthouse was overflowing the morning Ruth Holloway's trial began. People arrived hours before dawn, crowding the steps and lining the sidewalks, desperate for a seat inside. For years, Ruth had been a figure of dark fascination, the woman who buried husband after husband with a composure that bordered on the unnatural. Now, at last, she would face judgment, not just from the law, but from the very community that had once pitied her. Ruth entered the courtroom with her usual poise, dressed in black, her veil lowered just enough to shadow her eyes. She carried herself like a woman stepping into church, not a woman accused of mass murder. The murmurs that rippled through the crowd at her appearance were almost physical, a wave of disbelief and contempt. Some whispered that she still looked beautiful, others swore they saw something reptilian in her stillness. Whatever they saw, no one could look away. The prosecution wasted no time in building their case. They laid out the pattern first, a chilling timeline that began with Ruth's first husband and ended with Charles Denton. 8 men, all of them dead, all of them tied to one woman. The prosecutor's voice rose and fell with dramatic cadence as he recounted the illnesses, the symptoms, the sudden declines. He painted Ruth not as a grieving widow, but as a patient predator, weaving poison into meals and care into performance, taking lives one after another. Charles's written testimony was read aloud in court, his words hanging heavy in the air. His declaration that if he died, Ruth should be suspected silenced the room. To hear a man predicting his own murder at her hands was more damning than any statistic. Several jurors shifted in their seats, their eyes narrowing at the woman seated so calmly at the defense table. The most powerful blow, however, came with the testimony of the scientists. They described the exhumations, the testing, the discovery of arsenic lingering in the bones of her earlier husbands. Their language was clinical, but their findings were devastating. It was not coincidence, they said. It was not misfortune or fate. It was poison. Ruth's history was not a string of tragedies. It was a series of calculated killings. The defense, in contrast, leaned heavily on performance. Ruth's lawyer painted her as a victim of circumstance, a woman cursed by bad luck, demonized by gossip, and now made a scapegoat by a town eager to vilify her. He argued that arsenic could be found in countless household products of the era, that contamination was possible, that no one had ever seen Ruth administer poison with their own eyes. He emphasized her calm demeanor, her years of apparent devotion to her husbands, her consistent presence at their sides. He urged the jury to question whether grief could truly be twisted into guilt. When Ruth herself took the stand, the courtroom was electric. Every eye fixed on her as she lifted her veil and faced the jury. She spoke softly, her voice measured, her gaze unwavering. She recounted each marriage with carefully chosen words, describing her love for the men she had lost, the pain of watching them suffer, the despair of burying them. Tears slid down her cheeks at just the right moments, glistening in the light. "I am not a murderer," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound human. "I am a woman cursed by loss. I have loved deeply, and I have been punished by fate. But I have never lifted a hand to harm the men who gave me their hearts." Some in the courtroom were visibly moved, swayed by her performance. Others shook their heads, muttering that she was still acting, still weaving her web even as the walls closed in. The trial stretched on for weeks, each day bringing new testimony, new scrutiny, new tension. The newspapers feasted on it, splashing her face across front pages with headlines that called her the killer widow and the black widow of the county. Reporters described her every gesture, her every glance, as though the world itself were trying to decode the enigma of Ruth Holloway. The jury deliberated for days, their decision weighed down by the gravity of what they had heard. Was Ruth truly a murderer, or was she an unlucky woman swallowed by coincidence and suspicion? Could arsenic in the bones be explained by chance, or was it the undeniable mark of a killer? They debated late into the night, the echoes of Charles Denton's words never far from their minds. When they finally returned to the courtroom, the air was thick with anticipation. The foreman rose, his expression solemn, and delivered the verdict. Guilty. The word seemed to hang in the air, heavy and final. A ripple of sound surged through. The crowd, gasps, whispers, a few scattered shouts of triumph. Ruth sat perfectly still, her face unreadable. No tears came this time, no trembling of her voice, no collapse into theatrics. She remained composed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. The judge's sentence sealed her fate. Life in prison, without possibility of parole. The woman who had walked freely among her neighbors for decades, who had bent the world with charm and performance, would now spend her remaining years behind bars. As she was led away in shackles, the crowd pressed forward, craning to watch her disappear. Some shouted curses, others simply stared in silence. A few swore they saw the faintest trace of a smile on her lips as she passed, as though Ruth Holloway had not been defeated at all, but had chosen to play her final scene with dignity. The trial of Ruth Holloway became more than a local scandal. It was a national spectacle, a cautionary tale told in newspapers and whispered across dinner tables. She was studied, analyzed, turned into legend. Some saw her as evil incarnate, others as a tragic figure. But no one could deny that she had left a trail of death that would haunt the county forever. 8 husbands, 8 deaths, and one woman at the center of it all. The jury had spoken, the law had prevailed, but the legend of the killer widow was only just beginning to take root. Ruth Holloway was no longer simply a widow. She was an icon of dread, a story that would outlive her, passed down in whispers long after the courthouse doors closed behind her. When the verdict was read, and Ruth Holloway was led away in shackles, the town believed the story had ended, but in truth, it was only the beginning of another chapter. The courtroom had provided the drama, the sentencing, the closure, but what the trial had not fully revealed was just how meticulously investigators had pieced her crimes together, and how deeply the shadow of her murders stretched into the lives of others. In the weeks after her conviction, the authorities released portions of their files to the press. Reporters pored over the documents like scripture, unearthing details the public had only guessed at. They learned that the investigation had not begun with Charles Denton's death, as most had assumed, but months earlier when a quiet file had been opened after whispers reached the county coroner. There had been too many deaths, too many similar endings. The Denton case had not sparked suspicion, it had only confirmed it. Detectives had worked in near silence at first, sifting through records that dated back decades. The death certificates of Ruth's husbands revealed a disturbing rhythm. The handwriting changed with each passing year, the paper grew more yellowed, but the cause of death seemed to echo in every line. Gastric distress, sudden collapse, respiratory failure. Each one bore the language of a medical mystery that now seemed less mysterious. Autopsy reports were re-examined, their conclusions scrutinized under the new lens of suspicion. What once had been attributed to natural illness now looked far too uniform. The symptoms aligned too perfectly, their onset too conveniently timed. The investigators began to build a chart on the wall of their office, pinning photographs of the deceased husbands in a row, connecting them with threads of red twine. A grim tapestry emerged, one that no longer suggested coincidence but design. The exhumations had been the most harrowing stage. Families were notified, permissions granted, coffins raised from the earth. Reporters were barred from the cemeteries, but word spread quickly of the grim work carried out under lantern light. Forensic results had sent shockwaves through the investigation team itself. Arsenic, unmistakable and abundant, clung to the remains. It was not the trace contamination of the household or the environment. It was a killer's fingerprint, embedded in the bones of men who had once laughed, worked, and shared their lives with Ruth. Beyond the science, the detectives dug into Ruth's finances. They discovered bank ledgers with deposits that lined up neatly with the deaths of her husbands, small insurance policies, payouts from estates, property deeds transferred into her name. None of it enough to raise suspicion at the time, but together they revealed a steady accumulation of wealth. She had not grown rich, but she had grown secure, her survival purchased by the lives of the men she buried. Witness testimony, once discounted as gossip, took on new weight in hindsight. Neighbors recalled seeing her tend to her husbands with unusual precision, spooning broth into their mouths even as they turned away, refusing bites. One neighbor remembered seeing her scrape leftover food into the fire late at night, as though erasing evidence before anyone could notice. A family friend admitted that she had once found Ruth in the pantry with a small jar of white powder she claimed was remedy salt. At the time, it had seemed trivial. Now it seemed chilling. Even more telling were the accounts of the husbands themselves. Charles Denton's warnings were the most direct, but others had left traces of fear in letters, in conversations overheard, in the subtle changes of their routines. One had begun eating meals away from home more often. Another had complained of a bitter taste in his tea. Each man had sensed something was wrong, but none had escaped the trap. The investigators who had worked the case spoke later of Ruth's uncanny ability to cloud judgment. One detective admitted that during early questioning he had nearly believed her tears, her calm insistence of innocence. It was only when he stepped away, when he looked at the evidence pinned on the wall rather than into her eyes, that the truth became undeniable. She was, they said, a master manipulator, an actress capable of playing the role of the grieving widow so convincingly that even trained officers felt the pull of her performance. The public, once fed on rumor, now gorged on fact. Newspaper articles ran detailed accounts of the investigation, describing the arsenic tests, the financial motives, the eerie consistency of each death. Illustrations of Ruth appeared beside diagrams of poison bottles and skull and crossbone symbols. She was no longer just a local woman. She was a national sensation, her name synonymous with treachery. Parents warned their daughters about becoming too charming, too ambitious, too much like Ruth Holloway. Ministers spoke from pulpits about the dangers of sin hiding behind a smile. The investigation also revealed the failures of the system that had allowed her to kill for so long. Doctors had overlooked the obvious. Coroners had failed to question repeated patterns. Insurers had paid out without scrutiny. Each institution had assumed it was dealing with tragedy, not murder, and in doing so had enabled her. It was a bitter lesson, one that the county swore would not be repeated. For the families of the dead husbands, the release of the investigation files was both a relief and a torment. Relief because the truth had been acknowledged, torment because it confirmed what many of them had quietly suspected, but could never prove. They had buried their fathers, brothers and sons under the belief that misfortune had struck. Now they understood that the misfortune had a name and that it had shared their dinner tables. Ruth herself never admitted guilt. Even after the verdict, even after the files laid bare the breadth of the evidence, she maintained her innocence. From her prison cell she wrote letters, insisting she was the victim of a conspiracy, that she had been condemned not for her deeds, but for her womanhood. She cast herself as a scapegoat, a symbol of fear projected onto her by a society unwilling to accept her strength. Her words carried some weight among those who loved drama, but for most, they were hollow echoes of the performance she had given in court. The investigation remained open in one sense long after Ruth's sentencing. Scholars, journalists, and amateur sleuths continued to revisit the files, debating whether every death could be laid at her feet, or whether some truly had been the hand of fate. But even the doubters admitted that the weight of evidence was impossible to ignore. By the time the dust settled, the story of Ruth Holloway was no longer just about a woman and her husbands. It was about the fragility of trust, the dangers of appearances, the failure of institutions to see the obvious. The investigation had unfolded like a mirror held up to society itself, reflecting not only Ruth's cunning, but also the blindness of those around her. And so, in the final tally, the case of Ruth Holloway became more than the story of 8 deaths. It became a legend of deception and discovery, of a woman who wielded poison as quietly as a whisper, and of investigators who at last pulled the truth into the light. When the iron doors of the prison shut behind Ruth Holloway, many believed the story would fade into obscurity. Without the spectacle of the trial, without her steady stream of husbands to bury, she seemed destined to wither in silence. But the opposite happened. In the years that followed, the legend of the killer widow only grew, weaving itself into the fabric of local folklore and beyond. Life inside the prison did little to change her composure. Guards described her as unnervingly calm, a model inmate who never raised her voice and never caused trouble. She read constantly, wrote letters and kept to herself. Some whispered that she even charmed her jailers in small ways, drawing out small favors like extra paper or a second cup of coffee. Even locked behind bars, Ruth remained Ruth, controlled, composed, unreadable. Her refusal to confess became part of her myth. Journalists visited, hoping to secure a sensational interview, but she never wavered. "I am not guilty," she told them again and again. I was cursed by fate. For some, her denial was proof of her manipulative nature, a final performance to the end. For others, it stirred doubt. Could it be possible, even after all the evidence, that she had been wrongfully condemned? The ambiguity kept her name alive in newspapers and conversations long after most criminals would have been forgotten. Outside the prison, her story took on a life of its own. Writers penned lurid accounts of her crimes, embellishing details to feed the public's appetite. In dime novels and pulp magazines, Ruth was reimagined as a gothic figure, part temptress, part monster. Illustrations showed her standing over the coffins of her husbands, poison bottle in hand, her face a mask. Of cold beauty, she became a symbol of deceit, a warning about the dangers of desire and the darkness that could lurk behind a smile. Neighbors who had once spoken kindly of her now swore they had always suspected something was wrong. They told stories of seeing her walk through her garden at night, pale in the moonlight, her hands brushing the leaves of her plants as though she were selecting her next ingredient. They recalled her stillness at funerals, her refusal to wail or collapse as widows were expected to. Every quirk of her past was retold as evidence of guilt, her humanity rewritten into the script of a villain. The families of her husbands struggled, the most with the aftermath. Some found closure in her conviction, finally able to name the force that had taken their loved ones. Others remained haunted, unable to reconcile the woman they had welcomed into their homes with the monster she had been painted as. The children of her husbands grew up under the shadow of her name, forever tied to a story they had not chosen. Academics later dissected her case, using it as an example of early forensic science, of how communities dealt with female criminals, of how charm could mask violence. They debated whether Ruth had been uniquely evil or whether she had simply exploited the blind spots of her era. Poison, after all, was known as the weapon of those who lived in the margins. Those who could not wield brute force, but who could wield patience and subtlety. In Ruth, they found a case study that blurred the line between stereotype and reality. As the years passed, Ruth's health declined. She aged behind stone walls, her beauty fading, her hands trembling with time. Yet even then, those who visited said she carried herself with dignity, her spine straight, her eyes sharp. She never begged for release, never pleaded for mercy. She simply endured, as though prison were another stage on which she performed the role of the wronged widow. When news of her death finally came, it was met with a strange mix of relief and fascination. She died quietly in her sleep. The same stillness that had marked so many of her husband's deaths now claimed her. No poison, no spectacle. Just the slow inevitability of time. The prison buried her in a small plot on its grounds, unmarked, save for a number. Yet even in death, she refused to vanish. Within days, newspapers ran retrospectives on her life, retelling the story of the 8 husbands, the arsenic, the trial. Her face returned to the front page, her eyes staring out from faded photographs, daring readers to decide for themselves whether she had been a murderer or a martyr of circumstance. The legacy of Ruth Holloway lingered long after her body was laid to rest. Parents told their children never to trust appearances, warning that even the gentlest smile might conceal danger. Folklore twisted her into a cautionary tale whispered in hushed tones. Beware the woman who buries her men. Beware the widow whose love tastes bitter. Her name became shorthand for treachery, invoked whenever a scandal surfaced or whenever a woman defied expectation. But there were also those who saw her story differently. Some feminists of later generations pointed to her as an example of how society demonized women who held power, who refused to break under loss, who lived outside the narrow roles carved for them. They argued that Ruth had been condemned not only for her alleged crimes, but for her refusal to collapse into weakness, for her ability to command a room even in chains. Whether or not she was guilty, they claimed, her story revealed more about the fears of her time than about her alone. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between legend and reality. Ruth Holloway had almost certainly killed, the evidence too strong to dismiss. Yet the figure she became in the public imagination far outstripped the woman herself. She was transformed into a myth, a symbol onto which each generation projected its own fears and fascinations. In the end, what remained was the haunting rhythm of her life. 8 husbands, 8 deaths, a woman at the center, silent and smiling. The investigation had exposed her, the trial had condemned her, but the legacy, dark, complicated, enduring, belonged to everyone who told her story afterward. And so, the name Ruth Holloway lived on, not in love, not in family, not in peace, but in whispers, in warnings, in the uneasy acknowledgement that evil can wear the face of a friend, a neighbor, even a wife. That was her true legacy, not the bodies in the ground, but the shadow she cast over trust itself.